63 applicants stood in the glass lobby of the Halford building. Broad shoulders, black suits, polished shoes. The revolving door turned. Reed Calloway walked in, wrinkled flannel, faded jeans, and behind him came Ivy, 6 years old, holding a white stuffed rabbit. Laughter started immediately. Someone said it looked like a daycare drop-off. Reed did not turn around. He set his daughter down, smoothed her hair once, walked onto the floor. 27 seconds later, Brock Sutter, 251 pounds, 3-time MMA champion, lay face down on the mat. Nobody laughed, not even Sloane Whitmore, who had seen everything. Rewind to that morning. The Halford building rose 38 stories of blue glass above Boston Harbor, the kind of building that did not announce itself because it did not need to. The ground floor had been converted overnight into an evaluation hall. The air smelled like ambition and shoe polish. Holden Vargas, acting head of security, crossed the lobby before the registration clerk could speak. He was 39, thick through the shoulders, with the particular confidence of a man who believed he had already settled a question that had not yet been asked. He stopped in front of Reed, close enough to establish the size difference. "This isn't a daycare, friend. The daycare entrance is in the basement." Laughter from the chairs. Brock Sutter, sitting in the front row with his arms crossed, gave a slow nod. Reed looked at Holden directly. His voice carried no heat. "I have an appointment at 9. My name is on your list." Holden checked the tablet. Something tightened across his face, and he covered it quickly. The name Reed Calloway sat at the top of the candidate roster, added late Sunday afternoon, added personally by Sloane Whitmore. The first round was not about strength. It was about judgment. Each candidate had 3 minutes at a standing desk, one interviewer, a list of situational questions. The men ahead of Reed arrived with laminated credentials, framed certificates, photographs of themselves with notable clients. One man brought a folder 12 pages thick. Reed came to the desk with nothing in his hands. He set a single sheet of white paper on the desk. On it was a phone number and one line of text. "Call this number if you need verification." Holden stood nearby, arms folded, breath escaping through his nose, the sound a man makes when he has decided to be patient in a theatrical way. "You're serious?" "Very," Reed said. The second part of the first round was a response assessment. Each candidate watched a 90-second video of a simulated threat environment, a crowded event space, multiple actors moving through frame, a principal figure in the foreground, and had 30 seconds to identify danger points and propose a response protocol. Brock watched the video, paused 2 seconds, identified 4 of the 6 marked threat positions. The room gave him quiet approval. Reed watched the video once. He stood with his arms at his sides. 6 marked positions. 2 unmarked. The camera dead zone behind column 3 on the left side gives an unobserved approach angle of approximately 4 feet. The man in the green jacket has shifted his hand position 3 times since the video began. He's carrying something he hasn't decided to use yet. The room was silent for 2 seconds. Holden said, "Lucky guess." Reed did not answer. Upstairs on the 38th floor, Sloane Whitmore was watching the feed from the assessment room on the monitor above her desk. She sat in a straight-backed chair with a notepad on her knee that she had not written on in 20 minutes. Her assistant, Matty Reyes, stood near the door. "He doesn't look like the usual type." "No," Sloane said. "He doesn't." 3 weeks earlier, an unmarked envelope had arrived on Sloane's desk. Inside was a 12-page document. Service record, skill assessment, personal profile of one Reed Calloway, no sendername. At the bottom of the last page, a single typed sentence. "She will need him." Sloane had run the sender's number. She had not yet received a name in return. On the monitor, Reed sat with the same expression he had worn since walking in. Not bored. Not performing patience. Simply present. Sloane tapped her pen once against the notepad. Then she set it down. When the bracket for the physical round was posted, the room read it with the focused attention of men who understood what it meant. Most matchups were balanced. One was not. Holden Vargas had scheduled Reed Calloway against Brock Sutter. It was not an accident. Holden had arranged the bracket himself with the satisfaction of a man who believed he was solving a problem. If Reed could be removed cleanly in the first round, the matter would be resolved before it became inconvenient. Brock read the bracket and smiled. Not a cruel smile. He simply did not see it as a contest. Upstairs, Maddie leaned close to the monitor. "Sloane, they've put him against Sutter." Sloane was already standing. "You're going down?" Maddie asked. "The screen is too small." She arrived at the training floor without announcement. The moment she appeared in the doorway, the energy in the room changed. Holden moved toward her. "Miss Whitmore, there's no need to continue," she said, looking past him toward the mat. She did not look at Brock. She had already assessed him. Powerful, experienced, completely legible. She looked at Reed. He was crouching at the edge of the mat, retying the lace on his left shoe. He was not looking at Brock. He was not looking at the crowd. He was not looking at her. In 12 years as CEO, Sloane had sat across from hundreds of people trying very hard to make an impression on her. Reed Calloway was the first in recent memory who appeared to have no idea she was worth impressing. Brock rolled his neck, stepped onto the mat, looked down at Reed with something approaching generosity. "You sure you don't want to give your spot to the next guy?" Reed finished his lace, stood up, did not respond. He stepped onto the mat and turned to face the center of it. In the reception area down the hall, Ivy had stopped coloring, watching through the narrow window. The young staff member beside her asked, "Is your dad strong?" Ivy held Marshmallow tighter. "He doesn't lose. But he never says it himself." The referee raised his hand. The timer started. Brock came forward immediately. No hesitation. He had ended 4 matches already that morning, all under 40 seconds, all with the same sequence. Close the distance. Establish grip. Control weight. He applied it now with the confidence of a man repeating a proven equation. Reed moved back. Not scrambling. One precise step. He shifted his weight to the outside edge of his left foot in a way that redirected Brock's approach angle by 6 degrees. Barely visible. Also the reason Brock's grip closed on air instead of shoulder. Brock recovered and came again. A third time. By the 9th second, Sloane had stopped breathing at her normal rhythm. She was watching Reed's eyes. They were not tracking Brock's hands or feet the way a fighter's eyes usually tracked. They were still. He was reading something deeper. At the 17th second, Reed's eyes changed. He had spent 16 seconds not fighting Brock Sutter. He had spent 16 seconds learning him. At the 18th second, Reed stepped in instead of back. One arm controlled Brock's elbow at the joint. The other made a small adjustment to his center of gravity. Not a throw in the traditional sense, but a redirection so precise that Brock's own momentum became the mechanism of his descent. The technique was not MMA. It was not boxing. It was not anything the room could comfortably name. 27 seconds. Brock did not move. Reed released his hold, stepped back, breathing unchanged. He turned his hands over once, a mechanical check, and stepped off the mat. Holden was holding a sheet of paper. He did not seem aware that it had fallen from his hand until it made a small sound against the floor. Ivy appeared at the doorway, having slid from her chair the moment she heard silence instead of noise. She crossed the floor to Reed. "Dad, are you done?" Reed crouched to her level. "All done. Let's find you some orange juice." Ivy considered this seriously. "With ice?" "With ice." Sloane stood at the door. Her hand dropped from the frame. She turned and walked back toward the elevator without a word. Maddie fell into step beside her. Neither said anything until the elevator opened. Then Maddie said, very quietly, his breathing didn't change. "I know," Sloane said. She called him up before the bracket finished. The other 62 candidates were still waiting in the main hall when Maddie appeared at the door and asked Reed Calloway to follow her. A few exchanged looks. Holden straightened his jacket, opened his mouth, but Maddie had already turned toward the elevator, and Reed was following, and Ivy was beside him with Marshmallow tucked under her arm, and none of it had been submitted for approval. The 38th floor was quiet in the way that expensive buildings were quiet, not silent, but deliberately undisturbed. Sloane's office occupied the northeast corner with floor-to-ceiling windows that gave the harbor back in clean rectangular sections. Books were organized by spine color. Her desk held exactly 3 items: a monitor, a notepad, a glass of water. Ivy stepped inside, stopped, and looked around with the evaluative focus of a child who took environment seriously. It's nice in here. But there aren't any plants. Sloane, who had been watching Reed from behind her desk, looked at the girl. A beat passed. I know, she said. Then she looked back at Reed, and the conversation about plants ended, though something about it stayed in the room. She slid a folder across the desk. Sit down. He sat. Ivy settled into the chair beside him, opened a small notebook from her coat pocket, and began drawing without being asked to. Sloane asked about the technique on the mat. He said it came from specific training in specific environments. He did not elaborate. She asked about his service record. He said it was in the folder she had already reviewed. She asked who had sent her the 12-page document with his name on it. He looked at the folder on her desk. For 2 seconds, something moved behind his eyes. A recognition. A calculation. And then a deliberate settling. I don't know, he said. She watched him. He was telling the truth. That was the part that bothered her most. What salary are you asking? He gave her a number. It was reasonable. Not suspiciously low. Not inflated. It was the number of someone who had thought about what the work was worth rather than what the market would bear. She signed the contract without renegotiating. Downstairs, Holden received the news on his phone. He stood in the corridor outside the main hall, looked at the screen for a long moment, and then called a number that did not appear in Halford's company directory. The call lasted 40 seconds. Afterward, he put his phone in his pocket, smoothed the front of his jacket, and went back inside to conclude the rest of the tryout as though nothing had happened. The first 7 days, Reed worked like a shadow. He stayed exactly 1 step behind Sloane. Not 2. Not beside her. 1 step. The positioning was precise enough that Sloane noticed it on day 2 and said nothing because there was nothing to say about it. It was correct. It was how it should be done. He knew which doors were on delayed hinges before he reached them. He read meeting rooms before she entered them. Not conspicuously. Just a half-second pause at the threshold, eyes moving once across the space. He knew when someone in a room was carrying tension before the conversation revealed it. In 7 years of running Halford, Sloane had never had a security detail that she forgot was there because it simply functioned so naturally. She had spent those years finding ways to move around her guards. She did not find herself doing that now. She also noticed that he did not look at her the way people usually looked at her. The particular voltage that occurred when someone was aware they were standing near a CEO, that low-grade performance energy, the slight overpositioning of the body toward power, was absent in him. He was not positioned toward her because she was important. He was positioned toward her because she was his responsibility. The distinction was so unfamiliar that it took her 3 days to name it. On the 5th day, the daycare called at noon. Ivy's usual afternoon sitter had a family emergency and could not take her. Reed came to Sloane's office door and spoke briefly to Maddie. Then Maddie came in and told Sloane what had happened, framing it as a logistical complication that required his absence for the afternoon. Sloane said, "Bring her here." Maddie paused. Sloane had already turned back to her screen. Ivy arrived 45 minutes later with her backpack and her coloring kit. She said hello to Sloane, put Marshmallow on the corner of the waiting room couch, sat down with her supplies, and worked quietly for the entirety of the afternoon without interruption. At 4:30, she walked to Sloane's open office door and held out a folded piece of paper. Sloane opened it. It was a drawing in crayon, 3 figures in front of a house. 1 tall figure with dark lines for a jacket. 1 figure with long hair and a gray dress. 1 small figure holding something white and round, presumably marshmallow. There was no tree yet. Sloane looked at it for a long time. She folded it carefully and opened the top left drawer of her desk and placed it inside. She did not put it in the recycling bin under the desk, which is where paper without operational relevance went. That evening, Sloane received an email from an anonymous address. The message was 9 words. "You're being sold and you don't know it yet." Attached was a screenshot of a clause from a contract she had signed 6 months earlier, a partnership framework agreement with Drake Sterling Group led by Bennett Drake. The clause had a small section marker at the bottom, Section 9. She called her legal team. Her primary contract attorney did not pick up. His assistant called back 40 minutes later with an explanation that felt carefully constructed. Sloane sat at her desk after the call and looked at the framed mission statement on the wall across from her without seeing it. Reed was standing near the window. He had been there since she finished the call. She said, "Do you know anything about this?" He said, "Not enough yet. But I'm looking." The dinner with Bennett Drake was arranged for Thursday evening at a restaurant on the 40th floor of the Meridian Hotel, the kind of place where the lighting was designed to make powerful people look comfortable. Drake was 60 years old. He had the polished benevolence of men who had learned that appearing harmless was a more effective strategy than appearing strong. He acknowledged Reed with a brief look, the particular look of a man who had just completed an accurate assessment and found it worth noting. The meal moved through its early stages with the performance quality of two skilled negotiators who had agreed to enjoy the theater of the thing. Drake spoke about partnership. He used words like synergy and family without embarrassment. He mentioned 3 of Sloane's initiatives by name in ways that showed he had done his research. Then, during the main course, he said the words as though they were not loaded. The Q4 benchmarks, of course, will be the natural moment of alignment, given Section 9. Sloane set down her fork with the careful motion of someone who does not permit their hands to express what their face will not. Inside, something dropped and kept falling. She said, "Of course." Drake smiled with the warmth of a man who believed he had already won. In the car afterward, the city moved past the windows in streaks of white and amber light. Reed drove. Neither of them spoke for the first 20 minutes. Then Sloane said, "Did you read the contract before you took this job?" First morning. Section 9, Section 14, and Appendix C. She watched his reflection in the rearview mirror. "Why would you read my contracts? I can't protect you if I don't understand the ground you're standing on." She watched him in the mirror. He was watching the road. His jaw had a line of tension in it that had not been there during dinner, which meant he had been performing calm in that restaurant the way she had, and she had not noticed until now. That realization settled into her chest and stayed there. 3 nights later, the security log for the Halford basement parking level showed an 11-minute gap. No footage. No error code explaining the gap, just the gap itself, which was technically impossible under the current system unless the gap had been created by someone who understood the system well enough to edit it. Reed found it during his standard end-of-day review. He did not report it immediately. He made a copy of the log, closed the original, and sat for a long time in the security office on the 2nd floor looking at the 11-minute window. He had spent 4 years in a Delta Force unit that specialized in identifying internal network compromises, situations where the threat was not coming from outside but from within a trusted structure. He knew what the early architecture of a betrayal looked like. He was looking at it now. Holden Vargas had access to the camera system. Holden Vargas had a phone number in his contacts that did not belong to Halford. Holden Vargas had been in the building during those 11 minutes. Reed closed his laptop and began to build a different kind of record, not for the company, for himself. On the 12th night, Ivy started coughing around 3 in the afternoon. Nothing alarming, but by 6 she had a low fever and the particular expression of a child who was managing her discomfort with slightly too much determination. Reed came to Sloane's office at 6:15 and asked, with the economy of words that defined him, if he could leave at 7 instead of 8. Sloane stood up and got her coat. He looked at her. "You don't need to, I know," she said. His apartment was on the 14th floor of a building 12 blocks north. It was clean and small and contained almost nothing that was not functional except for one corner of the living room, which belonged entirely to Ivy. Drawings covered the wall in a dense overlapping gallery. Books were stacked in bright columns by height. A low basket held an arrangement of stuffed animals in some order that appeared to have its own internal logic. Sloane sat on the edge of Ivy's bed while Reed went to make soup in the kitchen. Ivy looked up at her from the pillow with the evaluative calm of a 6-year-old who was assessing whether this visitor was going to say something useful. "Do you have a mom?" Ivy asked. "Yes. Is she around?" "She's busy. We don't see each other much." Ivy considered this with the seriousness of a judge reviewing new evidence. "My dad is busy too. But he's always here." Later, after Ivy was asleep and the soup bowls had been rinsed, they sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea. The building made its evening sounds. The city pressed its light against the window glass. Sloane asked about Ivy's mother. Reed was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she had asked something she should not have. Then he turned the cup once in his hands and said her name was Claire, that she had been killed in a car accident 3 years ago when Ivy was 3, that he had been in Yemen when the call came, that he had been on a transport home within 6 hours, and out of service within 60 days, and that he had not gone back. He said all of it the way he did most things. Directly. Without ornamentation, without asking for a particular response. Sloane did not offer sympathy in the standard arrangement of words. She sat with it for a moment and then said, "Is that why you always stay exactly 1 step back?" He looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, the expression on his face was not the expression of a person doing a job. It was something older and less defended than that. He did not answer. But he did not look away. In the morning, she called the investigator she had retained separately from her legal team, the one no one at Halford knew about. She gave the investigator the phone number from Reed's original single sheet of white paper. The result came back within hours. The number belonged to a retired brigadier general named Edmund Holt, who had commanded Reed's unit during the last 3 years of his service. Holt was the one who had sent the 12-page document. Holt had known about Drake. Holt had known longer than she had. Sloane read the name in the report and sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling for a moment and then she said to herself, in the empty office, the only sentence that felt accurate. "I've been surrounded and I didn't see it." She called Holt. He agreed to meet at a quiet cafe in Beacon Hill the following afternoon. She went alone, an unusual decision, but she did not want Reed there until she understood who Holt was. Holt was 68, lean, gray-eyed. He ordered black coffee, no sugar, said nothing about the weather. He went straight to it. "I sent the document because 6 months ago I received a report from an old contact at the Pentagon. Drake Sterling is preparing a hostile takeover. They needed a head of security who could be bought. They didn't search. They placed one in advance." Sloane said, "Holden Vargas." Holt nodded. Holt explained. Drake had planted Vargas at Halford 14 months earlier through a search firm Drake controlled. Vargas's CV had been cleaned, his service record partially fabricated. Drake paid Vargas 3 times the Halford salary to hold the position until needed. Now was when it was needed. Sloane said, "Why Reed?" Holt looked at her for a long moment. 3 reasons. First, Reed is the only man I trust with this profile. Second, he was trained precisely for the situation you're facing. Internal compromise. Third, he paused. Third, I'll let him say if he chooses. Sloane did not press. She asked, "Why send it anonymously? Why not contact me directly?" Holt said, "Because if you didn't hire him by your own decision, he wouldn't take it." Reed left the work. He made a promise to his wife. "I needed you to meet him as a candidate, not as a favor." Sloane went back to the office. Reed was standing at the window. She walked over, did not sit behind the desk, stood beside him, looked out at the harbor. She said, "Edmund Holt." He turned his head slowly. A long silence. Then, "I figured it was him. Are you angry?" "No. He knows me well enough not to ask." She said, "The third reason he didn't say." Reed looked at her. His jaw tightened slightly. "Claire. My wife, she studied at Halford in 2011. She did her security engineering internship here before we met. Her father worked in financial operations here for 30 years. She always said Halford was the company she trusted most outside the army." Holt knew. Holt knew. Sloane said nothing for a long time. Then she put her hand on the glass of the window. "Not on him. On the glass. Close. You don't have to do this for her." Reed said, "I'm not. I'm doing it because you don't have anyone else to." She turned her head to look at him. He did not turn. That evening, an internal email arrived from her legal team. An emergency shareholder session had been called by Drake, scheduled for the following Tuesday, 4 days. The reason given was a Q4 performance review. Sloane forwarded the email to Reed. Her only message was 3 words. This is it. 4 days before the shareholder session, Reed tracked peripheral activity with unbroken focus. What he saw in the 48 hours before the session was not consistent with routine anything. 2 of the building's service elevators had been accessed after hours by maintenance badges that had not been checked out through the standard system. 3 external visitors had been registered under a consulting firm name that did not appear in Halford's vendor database. On Monday evening, the motion sensors on the 38th floor logged a 6-second anomaly in the eastern corridor, 6 seconds during which they detected presence and then stopped detecting it, which meant they had been overridden rather than fooled. Reed built the picture piece by piece on the security office screen. The picture that emerged was this. Someone was planning to access the Halford central server during the shareholder session, when every decision maker in the company would be in one room, focused on one problem, facing one direction. The server held client data for 900 corporate accounts. In the wrong hands, in the hours before a forced leadership transition, it was worth more than the merger itself. Tuesday morning. The shareholder session began at 10. Reed had 40 minutes. He moved through the building the way he had been trained to move. Not running, not conspicuous. With the particular efficiency of a person who has decided on a route and committed to it entirely. He cleared the lower floors, confirmed the boardroom was secured, placed Maddie at Sloane's side, and went to the 38th floor via the fire stairwell at the back. They were already there. 4 of them, professional and unhurried, moving toward the server room with the confidence of people who had been told the floor would be clear. It was not clear. What followed was not a long fight. Long fights happened when there was uncertainty about the outcome. Reed had spent 7 years learning to remove uncertainty as quickly as possible. The first man, Reed took from the left, a strike to the throat, the man going down without sound. The second reacted, Reed locking the arm, twisting it backward, the gun spinning loose, 2 strikes. The second man down. The third came from the left. Reed had anticipated the angle from the moment he identified the formation, a knee to the abdomen. An elbow coming down. Down. The fourth was the largest and the most dangerous. He lasted 11 seconds. Reed took a hit on his left shoulder, not structural, but it registered, he filed it and moved on. At the 12th second, the fourth man was on the floor. Holden Vargas appeared from the eastern corridor with a firearm and the flat expression of a man who had arrived at the part of the plan he had rehearsed. I need 15 minutes. Stand down and nobody gets hurt. Reed looked at him. I don't have 15 minutes. Holden raised the gun. Reed had decided days earlier. He would not pick up a weapon. He had promised Claire 3 years ago. He moved. 1 step, 2, Holden fired. The round grazed Reed's right shoulder and embedded itself in the wall behind him. Reed was already at close range. A wrist lock. The gun gone. A knee to the hip. Holden collapsed against the wall, the specific expression of a man who had bet on the wrong outcome. When the sound of footsteps on the fire stairs announced the building security team's arrival 2 minutes later, Holden sat against the wall with his hands immobilized. Reed stood beside him, breathing evenly, blood spreading through both shoulders of his flannel. Downstairs in the boardroom, Sloane Whitmore sat at the head of the table with 31 shareholders and 1 Bennett Drake. She had received the update from Maddie 60 seconds earlier through an earpiece. She had absorbed it, processed it, returned her face to its baseline configuration. Drake had been speaking. She let him finish his sentence. Then she said, "This session will need to be postponed. The reasons will be explained by law enforcement within the next few minutes." She let 1 beat pass and then looked at Drake with the direct focus of someone who had finished being diplomatic. Section 9 will also be contested under Clause 22B, which provides for nullification in cases of documented partner fraud. I have the documentation. Drake sat very still. I've been building the file, she said, for 8 days. The hospital was not where Reed had intended to end his Tuesday. He declined the first ambulance with the same energy he applied to most things he did not need. Sloane met him in the lobby of the Halford building as the police were completing their initial processing of the scene. She looked at his left shoulder and the state of his shirt and said simply, "I'm driving." He started to say something. She held up the keys. At the emergency intake desk, she gave his name and insurance information from memory. She had reviewed all personnel files on the weekend following his hiring, a fact she had not mentioned to him. The intake nurse looked at her, then at Reed, then back at her with a diplomatic absence of assumption. In the exam room, while they waited for the attending physician, Sloane took gauze from the supply shelf and began to work on the cut on his forearm. She did this without asking permission, which he found notable. "You know how to do this," he said. "No," she said, "but I learn quickly." He watched her work for a moment and did not say anything further. Ivy arrived 35 minutes later with Maddie, who had called the sitter and then driven over when the sitter wasn't answering. The girl came through the door with Marshmallow under one arm and covered the distance between the door and her father's bed in approximately 4 steps. She held his hand for a moment without speaking, which told Reed more about what she had been feeling on the way over than any words would have. Then Ivy looked at Sloane with the careful assessment she applied to questions that mattered. "Is Miss Whitmore the reason Dad got hurt?" she asked. Reed said, "No. Dad got hurt because of what his job needed him to do." Ivy considered this. The reasoning was acceptable. She turned back to Sloane, and whatever she found in the woman's face appeared to satisfy some additional question she had not spoken aloud. "Can you stay? I don't want Dad to be alone when he's hurt." Sloane looked at Reed. He was looking at the wall above the bed with the focused attention of someone who had decided to study the paint very carefully. She pulled the chair beside the bed closer to the wall and sat down. "Okay," she said. By 11 at night, the corridor was mostly quiet. Ivy was asleep on the waiting room bench along the opposite wall, her head resting on Sloane's jacket. Marshmallow fitted into the space between her chin and her chest. Sloane sat without moving, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the bench near the girl's shoulder. Reed stood at the doorway of the exam room, cleared for discharge but not yet gone. His shoulder had been properly dressed. He was wearing a clean shirt that Maddie had retrieved from his apartment along with Ivy's things. He stood in the doorway and watched the two of them in the yellow corridor light and did not speak for a long time. Sloane looked up. Neither of them said anything. The city ran its usual frequencies outside the window at the end of the hall, sirens at a distance, the low harmonic of traffic, the anonymous noise of a place that didn't slow down for ordinary emergencies. Reed walked back in and sat on the edge of the bench on the other side of Ivy, so that the girl lay between them with Marshmallow occupying the logical center. After a while, Sloane said quietly, "Ivy added to the drawing." He waited. "The one she gave me last week. I had it on my desk. She came in this morning before I arrived and added something." "What did she add?" "A tree," Sloane said. "In front of the house." Reed was quiet. The corridor light made a low, even sound above them. Ivy breathed in the slow, even rhythm of a child who trusted entirely and without condition that the world around her was held. For the first time in the entire length of that long and breaking day, for the first time, perhaps, in a good deal longer than that, the corner of Reed Calloway's mouth moved. It was small, it was quiet. It was, unmistakably, a beginning. 6 weeks passed. Early April. Boston was thawing, the harbor wind still cold, but the daylight had started to hold longer. The shareholder session was rescheduled for the week after the hospital. Sloane presented the full file. The 11-minute log. The Vargas-Drake evidence. The contract between Vargas and the search firm Drake controlled. Photographs of 3 meetings between Vargas and Drake at the Bristol Lounge in the Four Seasons. Section 9 was nullified under Clause 22B. Drake lost his veto on the board. Halford stock dropped 6% over 2 weeks and then recovered 9% above its previous mark. Holden Vargas accepted a plea deal. 12 years federal. Bennett Drake was indicted in the Federal Court of Massachusetts on charges of securities fraud, conspiracy to commit armed intrusion, breach of fiduciary duty. Drake Sterling Group fractured within 6 weeks. The 3 largest subsidiaries were sold or dissolved. Reed did not take the position of head of security. He turned down Sloane's 6-figure offer. Instead, he proposed a different role. Independent security consultant. Flexible contract. No fixed presence. He would intervene only when needed. "I need time for Ivy. And you need someone who isn't dependent on your salary." Sloane agreed. She hired a new head of security. Brock Sutter, the ex-MMA champion Reed had dropped in 27 seconds. Brock reported to Reed through an unofficial channel. The arrangement was strange. It worked. Reed went back to the boatyard in South Boston part-time. He took a side project, restoring the wooden interior of a historic vessel moored at the Boston Harbor Museum. Ivy came to the workshop after school, drew in the corner. Marshmallow sat on the wood rack. Sloane started coming to the boatyard on Saturdays. The first time, she said she was passing by. The second time, she brought coffee. The third time, she brought 3 sandwiches. Reed, Ivy, and a smaller one for a harbor cat Ivy had named Anchor. They did not talk about the night on the 38th floor. They talked about Cedar, about Ivy's second-grade class, about a book Sloane was reading. One Saturday, Sloane was sitting on a wooden chair in the workshop, watching Reed work. She said, without looking at him, "I didn't know an ordinary day could be this good." Reed stopped his hand, did not turn around. "I forgot for 3 years. Ivy reminds me every morning." Silence. Sloane stood up, came closer. She placed her hand on the piece of wood he was working on. Not on his hand. Just on the wood. Close. "Will you let me come back next Saturday?" Reed looked at her. "You don't have to ask." Ivy looked up. "Did you know Dad makes dining tables? He says when I'm old enough to sit properly." Sloane said, "How much is properly?" Ivy said, "Dad says when I stop kicking my chair." Sloane said, "I still kick mine sometimes." Ivy said, seriously, "Then I guess you can sit too." Reed turned away to hide the smile. His hand stayed on the piece of wood for half a second longer than it needed to. July. Boston warm. The cherry blossoms in the public garden had long since fallen. The broad-leafed trees were full of shade. Reed finished the museum boat project. 3 new clients reached out. A maritime historian wanted a bookcase restoration. A family in Beacon Hill wanted a heritage dining table. A bookshop in Cambridge wanted custom shelving. He took 2 and turned down 1 because he wanted to keep time for Ivy and Saturdays. Sloane went to Singapore for 10 days on business. She texted Reed every evening. Not work messages. Just small things. "The tea here is too sweet, I missed the coffee from your workshop. Did Ivy send you the drawing of the whale eating pizza, which I cannot interpret?" Reed replied briefly but consistently. She came back. The first Saturday after the trip, she came to the workshop. Reed had finished something. He had not mentioned it in advance. He pulled the cloth back. 3 cedar chairs. Different sizes. 1 large. 1 medium. 1 small. Ivy gasped. "Dad made one for the CEO." Reed said, "I made them for 3 people." Sloane stood very still for a long moment. She did not say anything. She placed her hand on the back of the medium chair. Reed said, "You don't have to take it. I just made it because I thought you'd like it." Sloane looked up. Her eyes were wet but she did not cry. "My father used to say to trust people who work for something other than money. I didn't understand what that other thing was until today." Late afternoon. The yard behind the workshop. 3 chairs set side by side, facing the harbor. Ivy sat in the small chair, drawing. Reed sat in the large chair, reading an old book of Claire's about sailboats. Sloane sat in the medium chair, doing nothing. Just looking out. Ivy asked, without looking up, "Are you staying for dinner?" Sloane looked at Reed. He did not answer for her. He just held her gaze. Sloane said, "If she wants me to." Ivy said, "I want her to." She went back to drawing. Reed stood up to go inside the workshop for more tea. When he came back out, Sloane had moved her chair closer to Ivy's. Exactly the way Ivy had once asked her to in the drawing from November. Reed stopped at the doorway and looked at them. He did not step out right away. He stood there for a moment. Ivy held up the notebook to Sloane. "Have you seen the new one? The 3rd drawing since they had met. The same house. The same 3 figures. Now there was a tree, drawn on Sloane's desk 7 months ago. And new. A small boat on the water in front of the house. 3 figures standing on the boat. Not touching. Just standing together." Sloane sat for a long time looking at it. In the chest pocket of Reed's flannel was the first drawing Ivy had ever given Sloane, given back to him by Sloane one Saturday for no reason. He had carried it for 6 months. Reed Calloway had promised his wife 3 years earlier that he would never carry a weapon again. The night on the 38th floor, he had kept that promise. But there were other promises. Promises he had not known he was making until he kept them. About standing one step behind a woman who trusted him before she knew why. About building 3 chairs when only 2 were needed. About keeping a small drawing in a chest pocket for 6 months. Those were the promises that only people who had once lost something very large knew how to keep.